Today we're talking greenskins on the channel, specifically some of the 5 scariest orc units there are around at the moment, and why I think that they're so good. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now I think the orcs took a bit of a kicking going from 8th edition to 9th, but despite just multiple nerfs hitting the faction, they do still have some very strong options available. In this video we'll talk through 5 of the units that I think are currently strongest in the orc codex at the moment. Not to say that there aren't some other notable ones, but I'll admit that these are some of my favourites. So let's jump straight into it then, and start with Smasha Gunz. Now this is certainly a unit that Games Workshop has taken a very long time to cotton on to the fact of why they're so good, and admittedly they did get a bit of a points bump going into 9th. Each Smasha Gun will now cost you 40 points per model. However, I think that they were incredibly undercosted before that, so even with the 20% odd points bump that they got, they're still some of the strongest firepower that orcs can bring to bear. On top of that, as vehicles they can now move around with their 3 inches per turn without taking any sort of ballistic skill penalty, so a Smasha Gun artillery gun line has gained a little bit of weird mobility. They've also got the blast keyword as well, which is going to make them far stronger against any units that are 6 models or more, being particularly potent against things such as big squads of Space Marines or Plague Marines or something. There are positives and negatives to having blast, as you can't fire in close combat with them as you would have been able to otherwise, but in terms of raw firepower it's a decent buff when shooting at certain big units. With Smasha Guns you roll 2d6 and try and beat the toughness of the target, meaning that they're generally pretty decent against anything that's toughness 7 or below. And with d6 damage they can certainly pull their weight against both vehicles and Primaris Marines, particularly things like Gravis armour. They're also very durable, they might not have the best save in the world, but toughness 5 and 6 wounds really isn't going anywhere fast, not without some dedicated firepower. Of course in Saga of the Beast these things gained access to the Grot Mobs detachment, which can give them a 6+ invul save and also allow them to reroll 1s to hit, and I think that that's still generally going to be worth forking out for an additional detachment for, even in 9th when they cost command points. Maybe just a patrol for 2 command points or a spearhead for 3 command points could basically just give you much more efficient Smasha Guns all game long, and I think that would usually be a worthwhile investment. With more line of sight blocking and more objective holding focus in 9th edition, I'm not entirely convinced we'll see entire armies of 18 of them quite as commonly as before in tournament play, but I think a few Smasha Guns are going to be a unit that's rarely going to be a detriment to an orc army list. They're just very efficient. Next up I've chosen to include the Grand Warboss himself, Ghazghkull Thraka, who certainly had some strong selling points in 8th, but I think he's really come into his own in the new edition. He only got a below average points increase, going from 285 to 300, which is far below the average percentage increase that most units got. He is of course an absolute beast in close combat, and he can advance and charge as per one of the new FAQs, as his previous wording didn't allow him to do this. He's a good synergy piece as well, giving extra attacks to orcs nearby him when they're in combat. But aside from his raw stat line and close combat hitting power, I think the most useful thing about him is the fact that it's literally impossible to shoot him to death in one turn. Ghazghkull can only lose a maximum of 4 wounds per phase, which means that if you're shooting him, then it's guaranteed to take at least 3 turns to do so, unless you can take wounds off him either in the fight phase or the psychic phase. I think that this is actually even stronger than it was before. Now each game only has 5 turns on, and you really do need to be trying to score objectives right from the first couple of turns, so you're just not going to be able to ignore Ghazghkull into the later game as much as you might be able to have before. The way that primary objectives work in the Eternal War missions as well, surviving on objectives is absolutely key for winning them, and as Ghazghkull can be pretty much guaranteed to survive a turn shooting, then you know that you have absolutely 0 chance of being shot off the objective if he's on it. He really is a pretty ideal unit for bullying midfield objectives. He does already seem to be seeing some play in tournament lists, and I think that this is likely to continue. Next up, I've chosen to include your basic squad of Boyz. I'll be honest, I was very down on these when the 9th edition changes came out, particularly with all the changes to hordes, more vulnerability to blast weapons, not being able to fire in 2 ranks as easily, and the changes to coherency all were big blows that the Orc Boy unit took. I still honestly don't think that they're quite as strong as they were in 8th edition, at least in terms of efficiently dealing damage to enemy units, just because you can't get them in combat quite as easily. But again, I've included them on this list almost just as much for scoring objectives as I have any sort of melee damage. They can still be kind of efficient against any enemy troops, but I really think that just having a couple of huge 30-boy squads can be a real asset to scoring objectives in 9th. Your opponent is going to have to do an absolute ton of work to chew through that many bodies, and they need to do it as soon as possible, otherwise you're just going to keep on scoring objectives and gumming up everything with a whole green tide. It also means that they can't afford to be gung-ho with their light infantry squads, and they will have to stay away from the centre of the table if they don't want their light infantry mauled by a huge amount of Orc, Boy, Slugger and Chopper attacks. So I still think that Boyz are a big asset to an Orc army list, and I do expect them to continue seeing play. If the meta really does shake out to being quite a lot of Space Marines and just guns designed to kill Space Marines, then Orc Boyz might actually become into a bit more of a better place if people aren't always taking quite as many weapons to deal with hordes. So perhaps not quite as scary on the offensive as 8th edition, but I think it will be pretty daunting for a lot of opponents trying to get objectives that have 90 boys sitting on them from the start of the game. Next we come to what I feel is one of the most improved units for the Orcs from 8th to 9th, and that is the Megatrakk Scrapjet. These things will now cost you 110 points, they're very fast, with pretty decent shooting with 5 rocket shots and some big shooters, and they can also pack a surprising punch in melee as well, with that pretty scary nose drill hitting a bit more accurately and also getting 4 attacks. I do think that they're the sort of unit that you probably want to take multiple of if you are taking any, just so some survive to do their damage. I think on the damage dealing side these guys absolutely would love to be Deathskulls, as an individual unit with a few powerful shots they'll get maximum use of that reroll to hit and wound. That also applies to their close combat, and the 6+ invul save doesn't go down too badly either when you've only got a 4+ save to begin with, and you might get shot by anti-tank weapons. At the moment, flat damage 3 is pretty useful, as we're seeing a lot of Gravis Space Marines in the meta, things like Aggressors and Eradicators, so being able to plink away one of them each shot that you get through is pretty decent. And if you take a lot of these, I'd be very tempted to take at least one Deathkiller Wartrike along, just so they can advance and charge, giving them absolutely ludicrous threat range from the other side of the board if they need it. Finally, they have a custom job that I'm a really big fan of. It's called the Corkscrew, and it's basically one command point at the start of the game for a unit of 3 of these to have this upgrade, and it essentially just lets them fight twice in melee. That would amp them up to being 8 strength 8 damage D3 attacks in melee, which I don't think is too shabby at all. The main downside of these guys is that they are just a little bit fragile, but hopefully a fair bit of that can be mitigated by keeping them at extreme long range turn 1 and using their decent movement to get in range for their alpha strike. Finally, I just couldn't resist including the Orc Burna Bommer on this list, as I can just see one cropping up in every second Orc list for the sole purpose of using the Flying Headbutt stratagem to deal an absolute ton of mortal wounds to the enemy army. I've certainly talked about this on the channel before, but essentially the Flying Headbutt can turn this thing into a turn 1 mortal wound nuke. You basically fly it over to the enemy army, the Flying Headbutt stratagem automatically crashes and burns the plane, and because this thing is filled with explosive fuel, every single unit within 6 inches will take 3 mortal wounds. It's basically the ultimate softening up tool to any sort of clustered enemy castle, and if you can get multiple characters and vehicles in it, then so much the better. Honestly, if you do have just one of these on the table, it's going to be fairly obvious what you're going to be doing with it, but even if your opponent spreads out all their units in some efforts to try and mitigate the impact as much as possible, then that's still kind of a win for you, as you're basically forcing them to position their army very weirdly to avoid one unit. If you think that the bomber is likely to survive for multiple turns, and any given turn isn't going to be the best use of that stratagem, you can always keep it around, drop a bomb, fire off its firepower, and maybe wait till the next turn until you get a more optimal chance. There certainly is the possibility of it getting shot down turn 1 if your opponent has enough long-range firepower, but even then I wouldn't necessarily say it's points wasted, as it means that your opponent has had to shoot that down rather than shooting any of your other frontline threats. It's not too bad if you've got a lot of other threats that really need to be dealt with as soon as possible, maybe like a whole load of Megatrakk Scrapjets which are going to be clustering towards the enemy. So that concludes my little rundown of 5 Orc units to watch out for in the new edition. It's by no means an exhaustive list. Other ones I was very tempted to put on were Mega Knobs and Death Dreads with custom Mega Blasters and the Sparkly Bits custom job. If you've been having any success with any of the Orc units or had any experiences against them, please let us know down in the comments. It'd be good to hear how these are going in game. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Hopefully we'll try and do this sort of video for a fair few other factions to try and highlight some of their stronger units. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos and you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all the videos does take a fair bit of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is appreciated. Channel patrons also get to see one video early per week, you get to vote in polls to see what sort of videos come next on the channel, and you're also automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway, which happens once a month with the chance to win some big kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.